Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our buddy read of Anthony Trollope's novel, Mr. Scarborough's Family. We are up to chapter 10, and I thought that was a good time for a brief pause before we read the chapter, and a bit of an overview. I've been giving you an overview as we go along, but I want to talk to you a little about what it is we're actually reading. I want to remind us all that we are reading a novel by a jobbing, working Victorian author. A Victorian author who is only months away from his deathbed, but still a working author. So this is briefly the story of Mr. Scarborough, a wealthy landowner who has decided that the best approach he can take to the insurmountable debts racked up by his eldest son, Montjoy, is to declare and prove to the world with paperwork that Montjoy is illegitimate, and that therefore none of the debts raised against him inheriting the property of Tretton Park are valid, or can be valid. And of course, Montjoy has no source of income on his own, so his creditors will be royally screwed over by this maneuver. Mr. Scarborough does not care. Instead, his second son, Augustus Scarborough, not his favorite in terms of temperament, will now be heir to the property. And when Montjoy learns this, he's furious. He doesn't believe it, but he's furious. And of course, because he's an addicted gambler, he can't change his ways. He goes down to Cheltenham to talk to Florence Montjoy, his first cousin, who is also, in his mind anyway, his intended bride, in order to win her over. Maybe some of you suggested in order to get his hands on her dowry, and learns in the course of that interview that her heart is tended elsewhere, that she had never any intention of marrying him, no matter what the world says, no matter what her mother says, that her heart is fixed on someone else, and it doesn't take Montjoy Scarborough much effort to know who that someone else is. A wavy-haired, pretty young man named Harry Annesley, who knows Montjoy. He knows both Montjoy and Augustus. He's been friends of theirs since school. And as evil luck would have it, soon after that interview with Florence Montjoy, Montjoy Scarborough and Harry Annesley meet in the middle of the night in a side street with no one else around, and they come to blows. And Captain Scarborough is left face down on the pavement by Harry Annesley, who does not see to his wounds, does not check to see if he's alive, and also does not tell the police. Neither the next day, nor the next week, nor the next month, when the story of the captain's disappearance is the talk of London. He doesn't mention anything to anyone, not just the police, but the man's own father. He goes down to Tretton Park to spend a little time with Augustus Scarborough. It's a big mistake, but he goes anyway. Has some interviews with the father. Confesses nothing. The most that he has done to ruin his immediate prospects is that in a dinner with Augustus Scarborough, he confesses to a lie. He tells Augustus Scarborough outright that he has not seen Montjoy Scarborough since sometime weeks back when there were witnesses. Doesn't mention anything about the last time he actually did see him that we know of, because Trollope has showed us that scene. Get down. There we go. And this is not, Trollope is not dealing with an unreliable narrator, so he has shown us what happened in that alley. It's only later, gradually, that Trollope makes us aware that Augustus Scarborough, a bloodless, horrible, flesh-creeping type of person who can't, frankly, wait for his father to die so that he can inherit Tretton Park, is also thinking that in addition to inheriting the park, in addition to inheriting the property, he will inherit Florence Montjoy. Apparently without any thought to what she wants. It's rather revolting, even by Victorian standards. It's rather revolting. And in the last chapter that we read, Trollope reveals that Augustus Scarborough has his brother. That Augustus Scarborough has known about his brother all along, from that night that Montjoy Scarborough, bruised and battered and still drunk, found his brother in his brother's apartments and told him everything, and that since then he has been in Augustus Scarborough's keeping. No matter what Augustus said, all that stuff that he said about where could he be, or I'm not sure that he's dead, or could he have left the country, no matter all the stuff that he said to his own father, to Harry Annesley, to the police, he's known about Montjoy all along, from that night. And that's where we leave things. Harry Annesley has left Tretton Park. He's headed back to, we presume, either Buston, the home of his wealthy uncle, or to London. And Augustus Scarborough has left Tretton Park, left his sick and dying father there, and has gone back to his own property, his own rooms at the Inns of Court. And that is where we are now. A bit of a pause in the narrative. And this is why I want to do this opening throat clearing before we read the next chapter, chapter 10. To remind you that Trollope is a working author. He's a jobbing author, and this is his last major work, which is critics speak for his last good work. So he knows what he's doing. He knows everything about what he's doing. He knows everything about producing novels, while you are busy wringing your hands and making sure that the floor lighting is correct, and then coming up with excuses to doom scroll on your phone instead of writing your own novels. He was just busy writing novels. He wrote a whole bookshelf of them. And he has reached a point in this narrative. He has given us two things in that last chapter. He has resolved a question and also raised a question. The question that he's resolved is what happened to Montjoy Scarborough. He had us on the hook for a little mystery there. He's disappeared. We know that Harry doesn't know anything about it, but we don't know who else might be lying. At one point in the narrative, everyone is implicated. Now we know that he is alive, and that his brother Augustus has known about him from the beginning. Known about him from minutes after, half an hour after he fights Harry Annesley. So that's wrapped up, right? That story is wrapped up. And I guess not one, but two questions are raised in the same chapter. In the same chapter, we're told, Trollope actually asks himself, how could it possibly be that a young man named Montjoy Scarborough, so selfish, so self-centered, so thoughtless, and a young man named Augustus Scarborough, so selfish, so oily and manipulative, and also a young man named Harry Annesley, who's neither selfish nor manipulative, who's good-hearted, maybe a little weak around the lip, but good-hearted. How could all three of these men love the same woman, Florence Montjoy? And while Trollope's asking that question, he tells us, well, maybe that will become clearer when we know more about her. So at the end of that last chapter, a little mystery has been resolved. We know that Captain Montjoy is alive, and we know who knows that. And we know that the father's not in on it. We know that he's not dead, that he wasn't carried off by murderers. We know a lot of that. We know that the tension of that little plot has been removed. So if you're a working novelist, which is a pragmatic working novelist, you know what you need to do next. You know two things that your readers are going to want to know. They're going to want to know, well, what's up with Captain Scarborough? And because you raised the question, they're going to want to know a little more about Florence Montjoy. And we get both of those in due time. We also get one other very important thing that Trollope had to have known he needs to do at this point in the book, which is more characters. We need more characters. Mr. Scarborough can't leave his bed. Harry Annesley is fairly one-note, like most of Trollope's young men are. Augustus Scarborough can only scheme so much. His scheming was only mostly of interest to us up to this point because we didn't know what he knew or didn't know about his brother. So the novel has to start moving in new directions. It has to. And that's where we get to chapter 10. That's where we are now, a little digression on the life of a working novelist. So we now read chapter 10. This is called Sir Magnus Mountjoy. New character, right away. It was the peculiarity of Florence Montjoy that she did not expect other people to be as good as herself. So right away, Trollope is addressing one of those things, which is to start to tell us more about Florence Montjoy. I don't want to spoil things here, but he can't possibly make her interesting. That falls to a lot of other women in this book, two in particular. It was not that she erected for herself a high standard, and had then told herself that she had no right to demand from others one so exalted. She had erected nothing. Nor did she know that she attempted to live by grand rules. She had no idea that she was better than anybody else, but it came to her naturally, as the result of what had gone before, to be unselfish, generous, trusting, and pure. These may be regarded as feminine virtues, and may be said to be sometimes tarnished by faults which are equally feminine. Do tell, Tony. Tell us all about this. Unselfishness may become want of character, generosity essentially unjust, Confidence may be weak, and purity insipid. Unselfish, generous, trusting, and pure. Anthony Trollope was none of those from when he was about 12 years old. But he's got the gall to lecture you about them, and also to say that they're feminine virtues. Here it was that the strength of Florence Mountjoy asserted itself. She knew well what was due to herself, though she would not claim it. She could trust to another, but in silence be quite sure of herself. Though pure herself, she was rarely shocked by the ways of others, and she was as true as a man pretends to be. In figure, form, and face, she never demanded immediate homage by the sudden flash of her beauty. But when her spell had once fallen on a man's spirit, it was not often that he could escape from it quickly. When she spoke, a peculiar melody struck the hearer's ears. Her voice was soft and low and sweet and full at all times of harmonious words. But when she laughed, it was like soft wings playing among countless silver bells. There was something in her touch which to men was almost divine. Of this she was all unconscious, but was as chary with her fingers as though it seemed that she could ill spare her divinity. So neither she nor Harry Ainsley is at all aware that they are attractive. Aren't they going to be insufferable as a couple? In height, she was a little above common, but it was by the grace of her movements that the world was compelled to observe her figure. There are women whose grace is so remarkable as to demand the attention of all. But then it is known of them, and momentarily seen, that their grace is peculiar. They have studied their graces, and the result is only too evident. But Florence seemed to have studied nothing. The beholder felt that she must have been as grateful when playing with her doll in the nursery, and it was the same with her beauty. There was no peculiarity of chiseled features. Had you taken her face and measured it by certain rules, you would have found that her mouth was too large and her nose irregular. Hundreds of words on what she looks like. Hundreds. Of her teeth she showed but little, and in her complexion there was none of that pellucid clearness in which men ordinarily delight. But her eyes were more than ordinarily bright, and when she laughed there seemed to stream from them some heavenly delight. When she did laugh, it was as though some spring had been opened from which ran from the time a stream of sweetest intimacy. She virtually never laughs. For the time, you would then fancy that you had been led into the inner life of this girl, and would be proud of yourself that so much should be granted to you. You would feel that there was something also in yourself in that this should have been permitted. Her hair and eyebrows were dark brown, of the hue most common to men and women, and had in them nothing that was peculiar. But her hair was soft and smooth, and ever well dressed, and never redolent of peculiar odors. Oh, Tony, you sweet talker. It was simply Florence Mountjoy's hair, and that made it perfect in the eyes of her male friends generally. How many male friends does she have? Honestly. It's just... Trollope does this. He does this Victorian thing. He needs to set out these ridiculous par excellences. And the thing is, I mean, it would make him a very boring author if you thought, like so many Victorian male authors, that was the only kind of woman he could write. But we know, by now, every reader knows, this novel was at the end of his life. By now, every reader knows that he can do, that his best characters are women. But not like this. Not the heirs of delight. Oh, God help us. She's not such a wonderful beauty after all, once said of her a gentleman to whom it may be presumed that she had not taken the trouble to be peculiarly attractive. No, said another, no, but by George, I shouldn't like to have the altering of her. It was thus that men generally felt in regard to Florence Mountjoy. When they came to reckon her up, they did not see how any change was to be made for the better. Who are these men? Who talks about Florence Mountjoy? Who sees her down in Cheltenham? Under the watchful eye of her stupid mother. Who does this? Is it maybe Mountjoy? Maybe his friends in the barracks? To Florence, as to most other girls, the question of her future had been a great trouble. Whom should she marry? And whom should she decline to marry? To a girl, when it is proposed to her suddenly to change everything in life, to go altogether away and place herself under the custody of a new master, and to find for herself a new home, new pursuits, new aspirations, and a strange companion, the change must be so complete as almost to frighten her by its awfulness. Yeah, think about it for a minute. Think about the lives of so many Victorian women who, unlike Florence, for instance, has known both the Scarborough brothers and Harry Annesley for quite some time, been intimate with them, had outings, picnics, evenings, we can assume. But think about all the young women who didn't get that. Just, I need to find a good husband for you, and you don't know him all that well. And you're going to have sex with him on the first night. And he is your master. You're going to the marriage with a lump sum from your father, maybe, but it's not yours. It's signed over to him. But anyway, and yet it has to be always thought of and generally done. But this change had been presented to Florence in a manner more than ordinarily burdensome. Early in life, when naturally she would not have begun to think seriously of marriage, she had been told rather than asked to give herself to her cousin Montjoy. She was too firm of character to accede at once, to deliver herself over body and soul to the tender mercies of one in truth unknown. But she had been unable to interpose any reason that was valid, and had contented herself by demanding time. Since that there had been moments in which she had almost yielded. Montjoy Scarborough had been so represented to her that she had considered it to be almost a duty to yield. More than once the word had been all but spoken, but the word had never been spoken. She had been subjected to what might call cruel pressure. In season and out season, her mother had represented as a duty this marriage with her cousin. Why would she not marry her cousin? It must be understood that these questions had been asked before any of the terrible facts of Captain Scarborough's life had been made known to her. Because, it may be said, she did not love him. But in these days she had loved no man, and was inclined to think so little of herself as to make her want of love no necessary bar to the accomplishment of the wish of others. By degrees she was spoken of among their acquaintances as the promised bride of Montjoy Scarborough, and though she ever denied the invitation, there came over her girl's heart the feeling, very sad and very solemn, but still all but accepted, that so it must be. Then Harry Annesley had crossed her path, and the question had been at last nearly answered, and the doubts nearly decided. She did not quite know at first that she loved Harry Annesley, but was almost sure that it was impossible for her to become the wife of Montjoy Scarborough. Then there came nearly 12 months of most painful uncertainty in her life. It is very hard for a young girl to be firm with her mother in declining a proposed marriage, when all the circumstances of the connection are recommended to her as being particularly alluring. And there was nothing in the personal manners of her cousin which seemed to justify her in declaring her abhorrence. He was a dark, handsome, military-looking man, whose chief sin it was in the eyes of his cousin that he seemed to demand from her affection, worship, and obedience. She did not analyze his character, but she felt it. And when it came to pass that tidings of his debts at last reached her, she felt that she was glad of an excuse, though she knew that the excuse would not have prevailed with her had she liked him. She has already told that to Harry Annesley, that it wouldn't have mattered to her. Then came his debts, and with the knowledge of them a keener perception of his imperiousness. She could consent to become the wife of a man who had squandered his property and wasted his estate, but not of one who before his marriage demanded of her that submission which, as she thought, should be given by her freely after her marriage. Harry Annesley glided into her heart after a manner very different from this. She knew that he adored her, and yet he did not hasten to tell her so. She knew that she loved him, but she doubted whether a time would ever come in which she could confess it. It was not till he had come to acknowledge the trouble to which Montjoy had subjected him that he had ever ventured to speak plainly of his own passion, and even then he had not asked her for a reply. She was still free as she thought of all this, but she did at last tell herself that, let her mother say what she would certainly never would stand at the altar with her cousin Montjoy. Well, that's all over with now anyway. It's only her mother who would insist, as Harry Annesley tried to tell her mother. You can't possibly be still sitting on the prospect of Montjoy Scarborough. He is disinherited. He's a ruined man. Even if it's not me that Florence marries, it can't be him. And not because I'm jealous of him, but because it would be a disgrace. The mother is not convinced of this yet, but Even now, when the captain had been declared not to be his father's heir, and when all the world knew that he had disappeared from the face of the earth, Mrs. Mountjoy did not altogether give him up. She partly disbelieved her brother, and partly thought that circumstances could not be as bad as they were described. To her feminine mind, it's not feminine, Tony, she's just dumb. You're the one who wrote her. This way, you want to know that. To her feminine mind, to her, living not in the world of London, but in the very moderate fashion of Cheltenham, it seemed to be impossible that an entail should be thus blighted in the bud. Why was an entail called an entail, unless it were ineradicable, a decision of fate, rather than of man and law? And to her eyes, Mountjoy Scarborough was so commanding that all things must at last be compelled to go as he would have them. And to tell the truth, there had lately come to Mrs. Mountjoy a word of comfort, which might be necessary if the world should absolutely upset in accordance with the wicked skill of her brother, which even in that case might make crooked things smooth. Augustus, whom she regarded always as quite a Mountjoy, because of his talent, his appearance, and a habit of command, had whispered to her a word. Why should not Florence be transferred with the remainder of the property? Her own mother. There was something to Mrs. Mountjoy's feelings base in the idea at first blush of it. She did not like to be untrue to her gallant nephew, but as she came to turn it in her mind, there were certain circumstances which recommended the change to her, should the change be necessary. Her own mother. Of course you're repulsed by it. It's a repulsive idea. Is she a chair that is going from one heir to the next? Florence certainly had expressed an unintelligible objection to the elder brother. Why should not the younger be more successful? Mrs. Mountjoy's heart had begun to droop within her, as she thought that her girl would prove deaf to the voice of the charmer. Another charmer had come, most objectionable in her sight, but to him no word of absolute encouragement had, as she thought, yet been spoken. Augustus had already obtained for himself among his friends the character of an eloquent young lawyer. Let him come and try his eloquence on his cousin. Only let it first be ascertained as an assured fact, and beyond the possibility of retrogression, that the squire's villainy was certain. In other words, let's make sure that he's the heir. I think, my love, said she to her daughter one day, that under the immediate circumstances of the family we should retire for a while into private life. This occurred on the very day on which Septimus Jones had been vaguely informed of the iniquitous falsehoods of Harry Annesley. Good gracious, mamma, is not our life always private? She had understood it all, that the private life was intended to altogether exclude Harry, but was to be made open to the maneuvers of her cousin, such as they might be. So does Florence know that Augustus Scarborough has maneuvers in mind? When does she first learn of this? How does she first learn of this? From her mother? Not in the sense in which I mean. Your poor uncle is dying. We hear that Sir William says that he is better. Sir William, of course, is the high-priced doctor from London. So the news about her uncle's imminent demise is uncertain. I fear, nevertheless, that he is dying, though it may perhaps take a long time. And then poor Mountjoy has disappeared. I think that we should see no one till the mystery about Mountjoy has been cleared up, and then the story is so very discreditable. I do not see that that is an affair of ours, said Florence, who had no desire to be shut up just at the present moment. We cannot help ourselves. This making his eldest son out to be, something so very different, is too horrible to be thought of. I am told that nobody knows the truth. We, at any rate, are not implicated in that. But we are. He, at any rate, is my brother, and Mountjoy is my nephew, or at any rate was. Poor Augustus is thrown into terrible difficulties. Probably it was Augustus. Probably she's getting all of her information from him. I am told that he is greatly pleased at finding that Tretton is to belong to him. Who tells you that? You have no right to believe anything about such near relatives from anyone. Whoever told you that has been very wicked. Mrs. Mountjoy no doubt thought that this wicked communication had been made by Harry Annesley. Which leads us to wonder, not just what kind of communication has Augustus Scarborough had with Mrs. Mountjoy, but what kind of a communication has Augustus Scarborough had with Florence, and also what kind of communication has Harry Annesley had with Florence? For a writer who's so good at conveying correspondence, it'd be nice if Trollope would show us some of these letters. Even their little notes, it'd be great to flush things out here. Augustus has always proved himself to be affectionate and respectable, and respectful to his elder brother. That is, to his brother who is older than himself. She doesn't know whether or not, are they still brothers? He's not the heir anymore. I don't know how to call him. Added Mrs. Mountjoy, feeling that there was a difficulty in expressing herself as to the presumed condition of the two Scarboroughs. Of course he would rather be owner of Tretton than let anyone else have it, if you mean that. The honor of the family is very much to him. I do not know that the family can have any honor left, said Florence severely. My dear, you have no right to say that. The Scarboroughs have always held their heads very high in Staffordshire, and more so late than ever. I don't mean quite of late, but since Tretton became of such importance. Now I tell you that I think what we had better do. We'll go and spend 6 weeks with your uncle in Brussels. He has always been pressing us to come. Oh, Mamma, he does not want us. How can you say that? How do you know? I am sure Sir Magnus will not care for our coming now. Besides, how could that be retiring into private life? Sir Magnus, as ambassador, has his house always full of company. My dear, he is not an ambassador. He is a minister plenipotentiary. That is not quite the same thing. You know that Mrs. Mountjoy doesn't know the difference. And then he is our nearest relative. Our nearest, at least, since my own brother has made this great separation, of course. We cannot go to him and be out of the way. We cannot go to him to be out of the way of himself. In other words, they can't go to Tretton Park, which would be the natural place if they want to get out of the way. If they want to go get out of the limelight of this scandal, they can't go to Tretton Park because it's the source of the scandal. Why do you want to go anywhere, Mamma? Why not stay at home? But Florence pleaded in vain, as her mother had already made up her mind. Before that day was over, she succeeded in making her daughter understand that she was to be taken to Brussels as soon as an answer could be received from Sir Magnus, and the necessary addition could be made to their joint wardrobe. Who is this Sir Magnus? Let's find out about it. Sir Magnus Mountjoy, the late general's elder brother, had been for the last 4 or 5 years English minister at Brussels. He had been minister somewhere for a very long time, so that the memory of man hardly ran back beyond it, and was said to have gained for himself very extensive popularity. It had also been a point with successive governments to see that poor Sir Magnus got something, and that Sir Magnus had never been left altogether in the cold. He was not a man who would have been left out in the cold in silence, and perhaps the feeling that such was the case had been as efficacious on his behalf as his well-attested popularity. So he's a career diplomat largely because he'd raise a stink if he didn't get something from the new administration. At any rate, poor Sir Magnus, he keeps being called poor Sir Magnus, had always been very well placed, and was now working out his last year or two before the blessed achievement of his pursuit should have been reached, which we can presume is retirement with a full pension. Sir Magnus had a wife of whom it was said at home that she was almost as popular as her husband, but the opinion of the world at Brussels on this subject was a good deal divided. There were those who declared that Lady Mountjoy was of all women the most overbearing and impertinent, but they were generally English residents at Brussels, who had come to live there as a place at which education for their children would be cheaper than at home. Of these, Lady Mountjoy had been heard to declare that she saw no reason why, because she was the minister's wife, she should be expected to entertain all the second-class world of London. And she's been heard to say that, so that is Trollope's way of saying that is true. So I think we can probably assume we can probably assume that all the negative things about her are true. This, of course, must be understood with a good deal of allowance, as the English world at Brussels was much too large to expect to be so received. So there were certain ladies living on the confines of high society who thought that they had a right to be admitted, and who grievously resented their exclusion. It cannot therefore be said that Lady Mountjoy was popular, but she was large in figure, and painted well, and wore her diamonds with an air which her peculiar favourites declared to be majestic. You could not see her going along the boulevard in her carriage without being aware that a special personage was passing. Upon the whole, it may be said that she performed well her special role in life. Of Sir Magnus, it was hinted that he was afraid of his wife, but in truth he desired it to be understood that all the disagreeable things done at the embassy were done by Lady Mountjoy, and not by him. He did not refuse to leave the ladies to drop their cards off at his hall door. He could ask a few men to his table without referring to the matter to his wife, but everyone would understand that the asking of the ladies was based on a different footing. He knew well that as a rule it was not fitting that he should ask a married man without his wife, but there are occasions on which an excuse can be given, and upon the whole men liked it. He was a stout, tall, portly old gentleman, 60 years of age, but looking somewhat older, who was, whom it was a difficulty to place on horseback, and who, when there, looked remarkably well. He rarely rose to a trot during his 2 hours of exercise, which to the two attachés who were told off for the duty of accompanying him was the hardest part of their allotted work, because they're young men, and they might like to trot once in a while. And I might point out here the Victorian euphemism for the upper classes, that you should get your exercise every day, was mostly exercise for the horses, who would not have done it voluntarily. But other gentlemen would lay themselves out to meet Sir Magnus and ride with him, and in this way he achieved that character of popularity which had been better aid to him in life than all the diplomatic skill which he possessed. "What do you think?" said he, walking off to Mrs. Mountjoy's letter into his wife's room. "I don't think anything, my dear." "You never do." Lady Mountjoy, who had not yet undergone her painting, looked cross and ill-natured. "At any rate, Sarah and her daughter are proposing to come here." "Good gracious, at once?" "Yes, at once. Of course I've asked them over and over again, and something was said about this autumn when we had come back from Pimpringen." "Why did you not tell me?" "Bother, I did tell you. This kind of thing always turns up at last. She is a very good kind of woman, and the daughter is all that she ought to be." "Of course she'll be flirting with Anderson." Anderson was one of the two mounted attachés. "Anderson will know how to look after himself," said Sir Magnus. "At any rate, they must come. They have never troubled us before, and we ought to put up with them once." "But, my dear, what is all this about her brother?" "She won't bring her brother with her." "How can you be sure of that?" said the anxious lady. "He is dying, and can't be moved." "Then that of his son, Mountjoy. It's altogether the most distressing story. He turns out to be nobody after all, and now he has disappeared, and the papers for an entire month were full of him." "What would you do if he were to turn up here?" "The girl was engaged to him, you know, and has only thrown him off since his own father declared that he was not legitimate. There never was such a mess about anything since London first began." Then Sir Mountjoy declared that, let Mountjoy Scarborough and his father have misbehaved as they might, Mr. Scarborough's sister must be received at Brussels. There was a little family difficulty. Sir Magnus had borrowed £3,000 from the General, which had been settled on the General's widow, and the interest was not always paid with extreme punctuality. To give Mrs. Mountjoy her due, it must be said that this had not entered her consideration when she had written to her brother-in-law. Okay, so Mrs. Mountjoy is not a monster. She's not saying, I want my daughter and I want to come and visit you for a month in Brussels. Oh, and by the way, you should probably say yes because you owe me money. She didn't think about that. She doesn't really care about it much. But it was a burden to Sir Magnus, who had always tended to produce from him a reiteration of those invitations which Mrs. Mountjoy had taken as an expression of brotherly love. So maybe they weren't an expression of brotherly love. Maybe there's just his guilt because he hasn't paid her back what he owes her. Her own income was always sufficient to her wants, and the £150 coming from Sir Magnus had not troubled her much. "Well, my dear, if it must be, it must. Only what I'm to do with her, I do not know." "Take her about in the carriage," said Sir Magnus, who was beginning to be a little angry at this interference. "And the daughter? Daughters are twice more troublesome than their mothers." "Pass her over to Miss Abbott. And for goodness sake, don't make such trouble about such things which are not troublesome." Then Sir Magnus left his wife to ring for her chambermaid and go on with her painting, while he himself undertook the unwonted task of writing an affectionate letter to his sister-in-law. It should be here explained that Sir Magnus had no children of his own, and that Miss Abbott was the lady who was bound to smile and say pretty things on all occasions to Lady Mountjoy for the moderate remuneration of 200 a year and her maintenance. Miss Abbott is Lady Mountjoy's lady-in-waiting. 200 a year and room and board, exercise, days off. Standard arrangement, basically. The letter which Sir Magnus wrote was as follows. So we finally get a letter. "My dear Sarah, Lady Mountjoy bids me to say that we shall be delighted to receive you and my niece at the British Ministry on the 1st of October, and hope that you will stay with us till the end of the month. Believe me, yours most affectionately, Magnus Mountjoy." "I have a most kind letter from Sir Magnus," said Mrs. Mountjoy to her daughter. "What does he say?" "That he will be delighted to receive us on the 1st of October. I did say that we should be ready to start in about a week's time, because I know that he gets home from his autumn holiday by the middle of September. but I have no doubt he has his house full till the time he is named. Do you know her, Mamma? Said Florence, referring to Lady Montjoy. Uh, I did see her once, but I cannot say that I know her. She used to be a very handsome woman, and looks to be quite good-natured. But Sir Magnus has always lived abroad, and except when he came home about your poor father's death, I have seen very little of him. So, brother and sister are relative strangers, and she doesn't know the wife. I never saw him but once, said Florence. And so it was settled that she and her mother were to spend a month at Brussels. Okay, so one of the two things that, there were actually two of the two things that Trollope had to do, knew he had to do at the end of that last chapter. He had to introduce some new characters. We're going to get a bunch of them. And he also had to tell us a little about Florence Montjoy. It's not much, but he's done both of those in this chapter. That leaves only one thing. We had several things leading us out of that last chapter. Need to know a little bit more about Florence Montjoy. She is one of the only major characters who has been unilluminated. And we need more characters. We need a little bit more going on in the book. Especially now that a major little mystery has been more or less cleared up. There's only one other thing. What about Captain Montjoy? What's been going on with him? So we'll move on to the next chapter next time. And I'll see you all then. Thank you, BookTube.